Lifting Up Jesus, opening his word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV.
Okay, let's understand this story from the perspective of the New Testament revelation of Christ. We can never ever base a doctrine on typology, on the literary symbolism of the Old Testament. However, it is also mistaken to overlook the fact that the New Testament, certainly most specifically in the Epistle to the Hebrews, but not only in Hebrews, indicate to us, tell us, that these Old Testament narratives are shadows, are types of Christ. They're about him. All of these things that you see in the Old Testament in Genesis point to Jesus in some way. And so we begin with the two women. We have Rachel and we have Leah. The genealogy of Jesus opens the New Testament in Matthew chapter 1. However, that genealogy does not begin in Matthew 1:1. It begins in the closing verses of the book of Ruth, chapter 4. So by way of background, before we look at Genesis 30, let's first of all go to the book of Ruth, chapter 4. It's actually quite a story. When Ruth conceives the child and the child is born, we have the epic of a wealthy Jewish man who takes a Gentile bride and exalts her. The book of Ruth is read ritually in the synagogues at Hag Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, that is Pentecost. To this day, it is read in synagogues as it was read in the ancient temple on the day of Pentecost, which we consider to be the birthday of the church. And so we read about this when the baby's born. And verse 11, all the people who were in the court and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth and fame in Ephrata and become famous in Bethlehem. The baby is called Goel, Redeemer, who's famous and who's from Bethlehem." Well, who was born in Bethlehem who's a Redeemer and who's famous, and who comes somehow jointly from Rachel and from Leah? That's the question. This is the background to the opening of the New Testament in Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus. This is where it begins. Matthew 1:1 picks up where Ruth chapter 4 closes. Okay, that's the background. So Rachel and Leah, they and their surrogate motherhood through their female bondservants procreate the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 princes of Israel that we read about in Genesis chapter 49, and which account for the 12 tribes of Israel, looking forward to Revelation chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 14. But also the 24 elders in the book of Revelation are without dispute. I can see no other interpretation that can be supported biblically. The 12 sons of Jacob, that is the 12 princes of Israel, and the 12 apostles. So when we look at the story of Rachel and Leah, the son was looking for a bride, sent by the father to find the bride from his own people. The one he wants initially is Rachel, but he does not get Rachel. Now, we deal with this in more depth on our teaching on the book of Ruth, which is available through the website. He desires Rachel, but does not get Rachel initially. He gets instead Leah. Initially, Leah is the most fruitful, as it were. But then, eventually, he also gets Rachel, and she becomes, as it were, fruitful. Jesus comes looking for a bride from his own people, Israel. Doesn't get the bride he wanted initially. He gets another bride, the Gentile church. Initially, the Gentile church has all of the babies. But then eventually, he gets Israel. In the second coming, he gets the bride he initially came for after he learns to love the other bride just as much. Then she becomes, as it were, fruitful. The whole thing is a type, a shadow of the Messiah. We need to read all of these Old Testament narratives Christocentrically, realizing that they are Old Testament shadows or types prefiguring the Messiah. Jesus is the invisible yet present character throughout the Old Testament, and he's not always invisible. Sometimes he manifests physically in the form of Christophanies. Nonetheless, with this background in view, turn with me, please, to the book of Genesis, chapter 30. And we'll respond to the questioner's question. However, we cannot just look at those verses of the mandrakes. We have to look at the entire context, beginning in the first verse. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister. And she said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel. And he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her that she may bear on my knees." Bebirkaim in Hebrew, on the knees of surrogate motherhood. For legal purposes, the baby would be the child. For any legal or social or cultural or religious purpose, it would actually be the baby of, as it were, Rachel, even though the biological mother was a surrogate. This had its equivalent in Levirate marriage, where a brother who survived would procreate children on behalf of a deceased brother. Levirate marriage is the male equivalent. Well, let's look at this now. She said, "Here's my maid Bilhah, go into her, that she may bear on my knees." Literally, in the birthing position for maternal delivery, Rachel would have laid back with her legs up, forming a kind of the back of a chair with her knees and her lower limbs, and that would have been against which Bilhah would have leaned back, reclined back in the stirrup position to give birth to the child. It just would have been the way they culturally facilitated it and practically facilitated it obstetrically. So what would happen? That through her, I may have children. So she gave him her maid, Bilhah, as a wife, and Jacob went into her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me and indeed heard my voice and has given me a son." Therefore, she named him Dan. Now Dan turned out to be quite bad of the tribes. Of the tribes of Israel listed in the book of Revelation, Dan is deleted. In our book, Shadows of the Beast, we speak about Dan and the relationship that was postulated by the early church between Dan and the Antichrist. What we see here is something that correlates to Hagar and Sarah. When Sarah had Hagar deliver a baby on her behalf through surrogate motherhood the same way, and Ishmael became something of a problem for Isaac, well, the same thing is alluded to. It sort of replays the same motif, and there's a reason for that. But let's continue. Jacob went into her, Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has vindicated me and indeed heard my voice and has given me a son. Therefore she named him Dan. Now Dan comes from the word din in Arabic, but also an ancient Hebrew word for law. And so it goes, Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. So Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister. I've indeed prevailed, and she named him Naphtali. Now again, all of these names mean something in Hebrew. Notice what's happening here. I have wrestled with my sister, as it were. With mighty wrestlings, I've wrestled with my sister. What it's showing from a literary perspective is a parody of Jacob, the husband's wrestling with his brother Esau. So his wife is also wrestling with her sister as Jacob wrestled with his brother. It's showing this kind of a parody. You understand? It's showing this kind of a parody for a reason. Water always takes the shape of its container. The experiences of a husband will be played out and in some way reflected or even replicated in the experiences of his wife within holy matrimony. And so Jacob is struggling with his brother, therefore his wife is struggling with her sister. Story then continues. They were ultimately reconciled just as Jacob and Esau were. Again, a future prophetic meaning, which we deal with on our Moriel teaching, The Legacy of Jacob. We explain it in some depth. We also deal with it on Jewish-Arab reconciliation in Christ, the prophetic meaning as corporate solidarities of both Jacob and Esau. These are teachings which are again available on the internet. You can, should you so choose, to explore these matters more deeply. You'll understand the typology and how it points to the eventual reconciliation between Jew and Arab as nations and as brothers in end-time prophecy. Nonetheless, let's look at this. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, in other words, Leah reached the point of menopause, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, how fortunate! So she named him Gad. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, happy am I, for women will call me happy. So she named him Asher. Now again, we don't, for the sake of brevity, I'll only explain the meanings of certain of these names, but they all have meanings that are of spiritual and theological significance. Now in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, it is a small matter for you to take my husband, and would you take my son's mandrakes also? So Rachel said, therefore he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night. God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to her husband. So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good gift now. My husband will dwell with me, because I've borne him six sons. So she named him Zebulun. And afterwards she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, or Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. She named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give me another son. Now, there are several features we have to notice before continuing to understand the text in its proper context. Notice the Lord gave me six. One had six, the other had six. both of whom built the house of Israel. So it is with Israel and the predominantly Gentile church. 6 and 6, as it were, 6 being the number of man. Both were necessary as co-equal contributors to building the people of God, to establishing the people of God. The 6 and the 6. Next feature we see, postmenopausal conception. Whenever you see a supernatural conception by divine intervention, Sarah or Hannah or Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, whenever you see these supernatural conceptions that were postmenopausal by divine intervention, they typify the Messiah, that the Messiah would be conceived supernaturally. They foreshadow the Messiah in some way, that God would cause something to happen in terms of a pregnancy contrary to nature. They, again, foreshadow Christ. All of these things foreshadow him in some way. Thirdly, give me children or I die. As we pointed out in various of our teachings, there were certain maladies in the Old Testament that were seen as divine judgments. They were not necessarily divine judgments, but they were perceived that way. One of which was blindness. To be a member of the community of faith and worship, a Jew had to be able to read the Torah. So if they were blind, it was seen as a divine stigma or curse. Thus the background of John 9. They asked Jesus, who sinned, this boy or his parents? Because blindness would have been seen as a divine judgment. Well, another would have been infertility. The importance of Yerusha, inheritance, was crucial to the survival of a family and to the perpetuation of the apportionment of Joshua. Additionally, in certain tribes, like Judah and Levi, it would be absolutely essential in order to identify the correct person who would be the high priest or who would be the king in the Davidic regal line of David. And ultimately, these things point to the Messiah, who would be the Messiah. Additionally, your child was your pension. Honor thy father and mother. Get the word honor, honorarium. The term entails much more than respect. It entails a financial obligation to take care of aged parents. And it's a commandment with a promise. If you don't do it, don't expect much longevity yourself. So infertility would have been seen as a social stigma because it would have carried the connotation of some kind of a divine judgment or divine disfavor. Give me children or I die. Take away my reproach. Give me a baby. Without a baby, you had a reproach. That's the background of the thinking socially and from a religious perspective at that particular time. Well, let's go further with this now. The mandrakes. The mandrakes are called dudaim in Hebrew. Dudaim. And they're usually considered to be something literally called love apples. Love apples. Similar to a raisin cake, they were love food of a fertility rite in the ancient Near East. Sort of the equivalent of a Valentine. You'd bring your wife some flowers and a Valentine, a chocolate heart or something like this on St. Valentine's Day, and it would be love food. It would be associated with marital romance and marital intimacy and so forth. It would have been a love food within that culture. It may have been seen as having aphrodisiac properties as well. These were the dudaim, the love cakes. Look with me, please, to the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon, chapter 7. We read about the dudaim, that is, the love cakes. And the Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 13, the mandrakes, the dudaim, have given forth fragrance, and over our doors are all the choice fruits, both new and old, which I had saved up for you, my beloved. This is within the union of love passage in the Song of Solomon. Again, it's a love food. Think of it as a kind of a Valentine, I suppose. Okay, so it had that idea. Now notice what happens here. There is a jealousy between the sisters. I guess when you're sharing your husband, you'd have to ask the fundamentalist Mormons about that. They would know, or Muslims about that. They would know. It is not a New Testament norm, but there are some people who try to make it into one. particularly cults or, of course, Islam. Nonetheless, let's understand this further. There was an understandable jealousy, but the jealousy had more meaning than that of the individual specifically involved at that time. One saw that the other had something that got her the man and the baby. One saw that the other had something. So look what she said. She said, give me some of the dudaim. Give me some of the mandrakes. Reuben found them. Now Reuben means to look at the sun. To look at the sun, not S-U-N, S-O-N, Ben. And the Hebrew word for son is Ben, like Benjamin, son of the right hand. To look at the sun. Reuben went and found the mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Rachel sees that Leah has something from looking at the sun that she doesn't have. You've got a blessing that I don't have. My life is devoid of this blessing. The intimacy with the husband has not produced the fruit of the womb. You have something that I don't have. One becomes jealous of the other. Now remember, we have to go back and understand Matthew chapter 1, the coming of the Messiah, the genealogy of Jesus, as the continuation of Ruth chapter 4, which explains the meaning of Rachel and Leah. Okay? We have to take this from Genesis 30. And in light of Ruth chapter 4, look ahead to the New Testament to Matthew. It's all a type of Christ. Provokes her to jealousy. The bride he wanted was Rachel, but instead he has to get Leah first. He learns to love and desire Leah, and Leah is the most fruitful, but then Rachel becomes jealous because she has something from looking at the sun. Look with me, please, to the epistle of St. Paul to the Romans. Paul says this. He wants to provoke his fellow Jews to jealousy. What is God's litmus test, or as it were, acid test, for the church being ready for Jesus to come back? Well, the church will be ready for Jesus to come back when it can provoke the Jews to jealousy. That is the ultimate test. Now, given the ugly history of anti-Semitism, much of it perpetrated in the name of Christendom by false Christians, and sometimes even by people professing to be evangelical, some of which exist today, it's quite a task to provoke them to jealousy. But as Rachel saw that by looking at the sun, Leah had something she didn't. She was provoked to jealousy and wanted it. The church must likewise show the Jews, we have something you don't have. We want to provoke you to jealousy to make you believe, as we see in Romans 9 to 11. She takes the mandrakes, that is the love apples, and from this, blessing comes because they come from Reuben, from looking at the sun. Two more sons then come. One is Yosef, and one is Zebulun. Yosef and Zebulun. Yosef means he shall add, or Yahweh shall add, because the Lord added another son to her. We know that Yosef, is a type of Christ. Again, I point to our teaching, one Messiah, two comings. Hamashiach ben Yosef, Messiah, the son of Joseph. It was fortuitous and providential that Jesus' foster father's name was Joseph. Why is that? Remember, Joseph was betrayed by the Gentiles. Betrayed by his Jewish brothers into the hands of the Gentiles. God took that betrayal around and made it a way for all Israel and all the world to be saved. So too, Jesus, the son of Joseph, is betrayed by his Jewish brothers into the hands of Gentiles, And God took that betrayal and turned it around and made it a way for all of Israel and all the world to be saved. Joseph is condemned with two criminals. And as Joseph prophesies, one would live, one would die. Jesus was condemned with two criminals. And as he prophesies, one lives, one dies. They bring, Joseph's cloak to prove he's not in the pit, as they bring Jesus' shroud to prove he's not in the tomb. Joseph goes from a place of condemnation to a place of exaltation in a single day, and every knee had to bow to him. So Jesus goes from a place of condemnation to exaltation in a single day. Every knee has to bow to him. Joseph was betrayed by his brother Yehuda, Judas, for 20 pieces of silver. As I put it, after inflation, Jesus, the son of Joseph, was betrayed by his brother Yehuda, Judas, for 30 pieces of silver. And it goes on and on like this. Upon exaltation, Joseph takes a Gentile bride. Upon exaltation, Jesus takes a Gentile bride. But Joseph's brothers, the Jews, don't recognize him at the first coming. They recognize him at the second coming and weep bitterly. Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. They weep over the one who was pierced as over a firstborn. And so Jesus' brothers, the Jews, they'll look upon him who they have pierced, and mourn as one mourns for an only son. They don't recognize him at the first coming. His brothers, the Jews, recognize him at the second coming, and they shall weep bitterly over him. This is Messiah, son of Joseph. Again, we have the tape or the recorded teaching, One Messiah, Two Comings. We explain it in greater depth. So you have Joseph, a type of Christ. But then you have Zebulun. Zebulun is also very, very important in messianic typology and prophecy. Look with me, please, to the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 4. Matthew, chapter 4. In verse 12, now when Jesus heard that John had been taken into custody, he withdrew into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. Those two sons, straight from Genesis 30, Zebulun and Naphtali. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who were sitting in darkness saw a great light, and those who were sitting in the land and the shadow of death, upon them a light dawned. From that time on, Jesus began to preach, repent, the kingdom is at hand. This is a prophecy that Jesus, that is the Messiah, would live in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. Well, where is this prophecy? It is in Isaiah chapter 9, made famous, of course, by Handel's Messiah. Unto us a child is born, a son is given. His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Peleoetz, Mighty God, El Gabor, Prince of Peace, Sar Shalom, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. A child will be born to us, a son will be given. His name will be called Peleoetz, El Gabor, Eternal Father, Abi-Ad, and Sar Shalom, the Prince of Peace. But this passage opens in verse 1 of chapter 9. But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later on, he shall make it glorious by way of the sea on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. That is where Jesus lived and ministered and directed his ministry from, according to Matthew chapter 4. So let's look now. There'll be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. Rachel was in anguish. And you have these two sons who didn't seem to amount to much initially, Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, Zebulun is a bit difficult to translate, but it has to do with a place of honor, a place of honor. Has the root of a kind of honor in it, but a place designated for honor. So something that was seemingly forsaken or even treated with, if not contempt, certainly just accorded no significance. Now it becomes a designated place of honor. That was the meaning of Zebulun and then Naphtali. So when we put these things together, this is what we see. Both of whom built the house of Israel. But we know from looking and connecting Genesis 30 with Matthew 1 via the book of Ruth, chapter 4, it's a shadow of the Messiah. He comes for one bride, doesn't get the one he initially desired. He gets the one he didn't initially come to seek. But after he loves her, then he gets the one he initially came for. Initially, it's the one he didn't come for, corresponding to Leah, who's the most fruitful. Then Rachel becomes the most fruitful. After, she becomes jealous of her sister. She becomes jealous of her sister because her sister has something from looking at the sun. Then the prophecies of Isaiah chapter 9 come into play, that the Messiah would dwell in the lands that were given to the descendants of Zebulun and Naphtali. And again, the other son that comes into prominence is, of course, Joseph, a very major type of Christ. That is the significance. I hope this all made sense to you. I'd again point out, we never, ever, ever base doctrine on type or symbolism. At the same time, it is co-equally as wrong, at least nearly as wrong, to ignore the fact that Christ is the central figure of the Old Testament, the same as he is the New. The Old Testament is a shadow of the New. The Old Testament is as much about Jesus as the New Testament is, as has always been said, Novum Testamentum invetere latet. The New is in the Old concealed, the Old is in the New revealed, if you like Latin, as Karl Barth put it in Latin. The Plymouth Brethren said the same thing long before Karl Barth. Nonetheless, it's all about Jesus. We're not basing a doctrine on type or allegory, but we are using the typology and literary symbolism of Genesis 30 and of corresponding Old Testament passages to illustrate, to illuminate the truths of the New Testament about Christ. These New Testament truths about the Messiah, about Jesus, are contained in the Old Testament shadows. Now, see, some people would say, well, if we have it all revealed in Christ, who needs the Old Testament? As we're told in Hebrews 5, unless you understand the meat, how the New Testament reveals Christ from the Old, unless you understand the Old Testament shadows, you have a spiritual diet of milk, not meat. You're eating baby food. You will never understand God's election. You will never understand the prophetic purposes of God for Israel, and you'll never understand the relationship between Israel and the church unless you understand correctly the Old Testament typology. And that's what we've looked at today with Genesis chapter 30 and the mandrakes. That is the dudaim, the love cakes, or actually in Hebrew they're called the love apples. My name is Jacob Prasch. Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for listening. God bless.